Chapter 16. Jacinta was moved into the bed where Francisco had died. It was nearer the front door, and she could see and hear people better. Perhaps Olympia thought this would help her get over her grief. For although Jacinta knew where Francisco was and who had taken him, she missed him terribly. The person who helped her most in those gloomy spring days was Lucia. Every day she would stop in, cheerful and matter-of-fact, on her way home from school. On Sundays or holidays, she would bring flowers from the serra, and as she arranged them on the table, she would tell Jacinta where she had found them. These are from Cova da Iria. I found this one at Valinos. This grew by the Lagoa. The best were from the slope of Cabezo. Violets, wild roses, peonies, and daisies in turn, all the flowers that the little girl would have picked if she had been well. Lucia brought diverting accounts of the chapel that some of the devout were building near the Azeneda at Cova da Iria. Everybody wanted to give orders, and no one wanted to take them. Hence there were some warm and amusing arguments in which we may be sure that Maria Carrera put in her 2 cents worth when the mustard of zealous resentment stuck in her sharp nose. No priest was there to arbitrate, and it took some time to find one who would bless the hermitage. Jacinta was amused, and then pensive. "I'll never see Cova da Iria or Valinos again," she said. "Yes, you will, Jacinta. Courage." "No. Our Lady told me that my mother would take me to a hospital in a dark building, and that I would not get well." It's true that pleurisy takes a long time to heal, but it seems that sick people can help others even while they lay helpless themselves. There was Lucia's Aunt Victoria, for instance, whose brilliant but erratic son was missing for weeks, until Jacinta began asking Our Lady to send him home. Then after a few days, he suddenly returned, with a strange story, suggesting something like bilocation on the part of the young invalid. Having spent all his money, he had resorted to theft, had been arrested, and had been thrown into jail at Torres Novas. One night he managed to escape. He fled to the mountains and hid himself in a pine forest. Frightened during a violent thunderstorm, he fell on his knees in the rain and asked God's forgiveness and a safe return home. Presently a little girl came out of the darkness and took him by the hand, and he saw that it was Jacinta. She led him down the mountain to the road that runs from Alqueidao to Reguengo, and then, making a sign that he should continue that way, she vanished. At dawn he came to a bridge that he recognized as being near Boledos, not far from his home in Fatima. When Lucia questioned Jacinta, the child could never explain, but said she had prayed a great deal for the young man. When the warm weather brought no improvement in Jacinta's condition, the doctor said she would never recover unless she went to a hospital for an operation, for she had purulent pleurisy as a result of the bronchial pneumonia. And one morning in July of 1919, Timarto placed her on the back of a burro and took her to Orem. The hospital there was a large, white, rather cheerful building, and the ward where Jacinta was put to bed was bright and airy. This could hardly be the dark place where Our Lady said her mother would take her. Olympia went to see her there, however, and found her cheerful and uncomplaining, even when some delicacies that a visitor had brought had vanished from the top drawer of the medicine cabinet. "It was that glutton of a nurse," said Olympia, but Jacinta did not care. Lucia visited her only once. That was the summer when her father died, July 31st, 1919. She records the event briefly in her memoirs, without comment or emotion. Yet it seems likely enough that all his family missed Antonio, for if he was not the best husband and father in the world, he was not the worst, and it was only when we had a drop on him, as Maria Carrera observed, that he was inclined to be ill-tempered. Certainly Maria Rosa grieved for him, and her health rapidly failed after his death. She began to have alarming attacks of weakness and shortness of breath, which the physician attributed to her old heart ailment. After one of these seizures, Maria de los Angeles said to her youngest sister, "Look here, Lucia, you haven't any father now, and if your mother dies, you will be an orphan. If it is true that you saw Our Lady, ask her to cure your mother." The child arose without a word, went to her room, put on a heavy woolen dress, for it was cold and rainy, and went to Cova da Iria to prostrate herself in the mud before the Azeneda. When she returned after a few hours, she brought a handful of red earth, and told Gloria to make a tea of it. She had promised Our Lady, she said, that if her mother was cured, they would all go on their knees from the highway to the place of the apparitions for 9 days in succession, and give food to 9 poor girls. It's Maria de los Angeles who tells this curious story to Father de Marchi. Gloria prepared the tea, and I gave it to Mother. "What tea is this?" she asked. "It's of the blossoms of violets," we said, and she drank all of it. There were no more heart attacks, though certain other infirmities did continue, and faithful to Lucia's promise, she and all her sisters went to Cova da Iria for 9 evenings after supper, painfully hobbling down the stony slope on their knees, while Maria Rosa followed on foot, giving thanks to God. Lucia was unable to obtain any such favor for her little friend in the hospital at Orem. An incision had been made and a drain inserted. Yet after 2 months, Jacinta was no better. In fact, she was worse than ever. It was costing T. Marto 1,200 reis, or about $1.35 every day, and he had spent all he could afford. At the end of August, he hitched up the burrita again and brought the invalid home. Olympia hardly knew her child. She was so thin, pale, transparent, emaciated. There was a great open wound in her chest that had to be dressed every day. Dr. Formichao, who saw her in October, described her as a living skeleton, her arms nothing but bones, her face all eyes, her cheeks wasted by fever. The good theologian was one of the 600 persons who went to Fatima on the 13th of October that year to celebrate the 2nd anniversary of the great miracle. That was the day when the pilgrims were startled by 21 terrific explosions, one after another, near the Azeneda. But it was not an attack by the enemy, as many feared. It was only a workman from Porto de Mos, who had fired a salvo of 21 bombs in honor of Our Lady, to show her his gratitude for a favor unexpectedly granted to him. There is no doubt that the peasants had taken the Fatima devotion to their hearts. One small indication of this was the growth of a fund of small coins left by the tree. By the summer of 1918, the total was 357,000 reis, or about $500. This continued to be a torment for Maria Carrera, the unofficial custodian of the shrine by common consent, all the more so when people began to malign her, insinuating that she was feathering her own nest. In vain she tried to get the prior to accept the money, and in vain he wrote the Patriarchate for instructions. At one time, the administrator of Orem summoned Maria's husband to Orem to give an accounting. After the death of Antonio, Maria Rosa sent her sons, as owners of the land at Cova da Iria, to demand that Maria da Copelina turn the fund over to a commission. Fortunately, an appeal for arbitration was made to the vicar of Olival, Father Faustino Ferreira, who arranged a friendly agreement until the money could be delivered to some diocesan authority. After that, Maria Rosa and Maria Carrera became bosom friends. Another happy result was that Lucia found in the vicar of Olival a loyal friend and wise director. It seemed to a few thoughtful men like him that the devotion at Cova da Iria was already bringing blessings upon Portugal and on the world. Not only had the war ended, but diplomatic relations between Lisboa and the Holy See had been resumed in July 1918. and in December 1919, Pope Benedict XV appealed to all Portuguese Catholics to submit to the Republic as the lawfully constituted authority, and to accept offices if they were offered. While the beatification of Nuno Alvares, the victor of Albujarrota, contributed much to the growth of good feeling. Nevertheless, the government continued to persecute the Church in many ways, and it never relented in its efforts to stamp out the devotion at Fatima. Perhaps this partly explains why His Eminence, Cardinal Mendes Belo, Patriarch of Lisboa, threatened to excommunicate any priest who spoke in favor of the apparitions. A strong and able man, he was inclined to think in terms of power, of public opinion, of prudent expediency. He may have felt that when relations between church and state were improving, it would be unwise to allow a new and untested devotion to disturb them. Under these circumstances, it took courage for Dr. Formigao to befriend Jacinta. Unfortunately, he was able to do no more at this time than suggest that she ought to be sent to some really good sanitarium. Neither he nor Timarto had the means of accomplishing this, and he returned to Santarem feeling unhappy and helpless. During the warm days of autumn, however, Jacinta began to improve. She was able to leave her bed, then to go outdoors, and finally to attend Mass at Fatima on Sunday. Once or twice she went as far as the Covadairia. When her parents learned of this, they put a stop to it, and none too soon, for with the first blast of cold weather she became feverish again, and had to go back to bed. This troubled her little, so long as she was able to get up and say her rosary, kneeling in contemplation with her head on the floor, as the angel had done, but it gradually became more difficult. When I am alone, I get out of bed to say the prayers of the angel, she confided to Lucia. But now I can't put my head on the floor any more, because I fall, so I pray only on my knees. When Father Faustino Ferreira heard this from Lucia, he told Jacinta that she must say all her prayers lying down in bed. "And our Lord will be content?" she asked anxiously. "Yes, our Lord wants you to do what the vicar orders." "All right, I won't get up any more." Even in bed, Jacinta continued to do penance for some of those hale and hearty sinners whom she had never seen. When thirsty, she would go without a drink. She would refuse some grapes for which her mouth watered, or she would lie awake wanting to get up and pray, and offering up the desire as a penance rather than disobey her mother. And this conflict would keep her awake all night. It was only to Lucia that she revealed what a terrible pain she had in her chest. But it was to honor the Immaculate Heart of Mary. "Tell all the people that God gives them graces through her," she said. "If only I could put in the heart of everybody that light that I have here in my breast to burn me and make me love the heart of Jesus and the heart of Mary so much. I don't know how it is. I feel our Lord inside of me. I understand what he says, and I don't see or hear him, but it is so good to be with him. Look, do you know what? Our Lord is sad, because Our Lady told us not to offend him any more, because he is so much offended, and nobody pays any attention. They keep right on doing the same sins." When Lucia came after Mass, Jacinta would say, "Did you receive Holy Communion?" "Yes." "Come over here near me, because you have in your heart the hidden Jesus. Oh, I wish I could go to communion." Yet 3 times during the year, Jacinta saw her little Mother of Heaven standing by her bed, encouraging her. The last of these visions was late in December 1919. "Our Lady came to see me last night," she reported joyfully. "She told me that I am going to Lisboa, to another hospital. She said that after I suffer a great deal, I will die. I will die all alone. But she told me not to be afraid, for she will come and find me and take me to heaven." A little later, as certain implications became clear, Jacinta began to cry, her bony hand clinging to her friend's arm. "I'll never see you again, Lucia. I'll come to see you in the hospital. No, you won't come to see me. Look, pray for me a lot, for I die alone. One day, when Lucia brought her a holy card with an image of the Mother of Sorrows on it, she looked at it thoughtfully a moment, and then cried in anguish, "Oh, my little Mother of Heaven, do I really have to die alone?" There was something heartbreaking in this, suggesting the awful cry in the garden, "Father, if it be possible." Lucia, too, was weeping as she clasped her in her arms and groped for words of consolation. "What do you care if you die alone, Jacinta, if Our Lady is coming to take you? It's true, I don't care, but I don't know how it is. Sometimes I forget that she's coming to take me." Olympia had to get most of the information about her child's inner life from Lucia. "What did Jacinta say to you today?" she would whisper at the door. "Ask Jacinta what she's thinking of when she has her hands over her face so long without moving. I asked her, but she smiled and didn't answer me." When Lucia asked Jacinta, Jacinta replied, "I'm thinking of our Lord and Our Lady, and of," here she whispered part of the secret, "I like to think of them." This was little satisfaction to Olympia, since the secret remained untold. "The life of these girls is an enigma," she complained to Maria Rosa. "It certainly is," agreed Lucia's mother tartly. "When they're alone, they talk in a corner, and nobody can catch a word of what they say, no matter how much they listen. And then when anyone comes, they lower their heads and don't say a word. I can't understand this mystery." No one but Lucia took Jacinta's talk about a hospital in Lisboa seriously. Peasants could seldom afford hospitals, and Lisboa was 90 miles away. It sounded like a delirious dream, until one day in January 1920, when they saw an automobile stop in front of the Marto cottage. The visitor was Dr. Formigao, and he had with him a lady and gentleman whom he had interested in Jacinta's case, and who had come all the way from Lisboa to see her. Dr. Enrico Lisboa, a noted specialist in ophthalmology, and his wife. A brief examination convinced Dr. Lisboa that the child would soon die if she were not sent to a good hospital. With his connections in the capital, he could easily arrange this. He and some of his friends, including the Baron of Albaicere, would take care of all the expenses. T. Marto and his wife objected that their daughter had been worse after one hospital treatment, and that in any case it was useless to attempt to prolong her life if Our Lady, as they believed, had promised to come for her soon. "The will of Our Lady," replied the physician gravely, "is superior to all human considerations. But the only way to make sure that Our Lady does in fact wish to take her is to exhaust all scientific means of preserving her life." It was decided then that Tia Olympia should take her to Lisboa as soon as the necessary arrangements could be made. Jacinta was not surprised. She'd been expecting something like this, and for some reason she became notably better as the time for her departure drew near. One fine January day, her mother and a neighbor took her on the back of a burrita to Cova da Iria for a farewell visit. At the Lagoa, she asked to get down, and they all said the rosary. Then she picked some wild flowers, which she carried to the place of the apparitions, and laid in the little chapel as an offering to Our Lady. She knelt by the Azeneda to say a last prayer. When the two women helped her to her feet again, she looked about at the sky and the moor, and remarked, "Mother, when Our Lady went away, she passed over those trees, and then she entered heaven so quickly that I thought they must have pinched her feet at the door." Next morning she said goodbye to her father and to her best friend. Lucia wrote, "It cut me to the heart. I held her a long time in my arms. She said to me, crying, 'We shall never meet again. Pray for me a lot till I go to heaven, and afterwards I'll pray a lot for you. Never tell anybody the secret, even if they kill you. love Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary a great deal, and make many sacrifices for sinners. Goodbye, Jacinta. Goodbye, Lucia. Olimpia and her oldest son Antonio took Jacinta to Chao de Machas, where they boarded a train for Lisboa, arriving 4 or 5 hours later at the noisy and dusty station called Rocio. None of them had ever been in the big city before. Olimpia carried a white handkerchief in her right hand, which she fluttered from time to time, and Jacinta had one in her left hand. These were the signals agreed upon so that certain ladies, friends of the Baron of Albazire, might recognize them. But no ladies appeared. Antonio, who could read, went to make some inquiries. When he failed to return, his mother feared he was lost, and went about the station crying, "Antonio! Antonio!" After what seemed an interminable time, Antonio sauntered back. A moment later 3 well-dressed ladies introduced themselves as the friends of the Baron. The first thing to be done was to find lodgings for the wayfarers, for none of the ladies had room for them at home. So they all went about the city, applying at various houses where there might be accommodations. Olimpia was tired, Jacinta almost dead, when after many refusals a good woman agreed to take them in. They remained with her for a week. At the end of that time, a place had been found for Jacinta in the Asilo de la Rua da Estrella, next to the church of Our Lady of Miracles. Dona Maria da Purificação Godino, the head of the institution, was a Franciscan nun who went about dressed as a laywoman, collecting alms, with which she managed to house, clothe, feed, and educate from 20 to 25 orphan girls. She had a particular devotion to Our Lady, and having heard of her appearances at Fatima, was praying to be allowed to go there and see the children so favored, when someone interrupted to tell her that Jacinta was in Lisboa. From that moment she took the child to her motherly heart, made her at home in the orphanage, and had her sit every day in a sunny window looking out at the garden of the Estrella, where there was always something interesting to see for Jacinta. Jacinta was happy. She liked living in a convent. It seemed heavenly to think that the hidden Lord was there all the time, and that she could visit him every day and receive him at Mass every morning. She could never understand how visitors could laugh and gossip in the chapel, and she asked Mother Godino to remind them to have more respect for the one who was there. When these efforts had little effect, she said positively, "Then the Cardinal will have to be told about it. Our Lady doesn't want people to talk in the church." Mother Godino believed that she had a saint under her roof. "She speaks with such authority," she said. She noticed that Jacinta had little to do with the other girls, except now and then give one of them some motherly advice on truthfulness or obedience. Often the nun would sit with her by the window and draw her into conversation. Afterwards she would write down some of the more striking things she said. "Wars are nothing but punishments for the sins of the world." Or, "Our Lady can no longer hold up the arm of her beloved Son over the world. It's necessary to do penance. If people reform, our Lord will save the world. But if they do not reform, He's going to punish it." And another one. "Dear little Our Lady, I am so sorry for Our Lady. She is so sad." Or, "Pray much, my little mother, for sinners. Pray much for priests. Pray much for religious. Priests should occupy themselves with the affairs of the Church. Priests should be pure, very pure. The disobedience of priests and religious to their superiors and to the Holy Father offends our Lord very greatly." Another one. "My little mother, pray for those who govern. Alas for those who persecute the religion of our Lord. If the government leaves the Church in peace and gives liberty to the Holy Faith, it will be blessed by God. My little mother, do not walk in the midst of luxury. Flee from riches. Be very friendly to holy poverty and to silence. Have great charity even for the wicked. Speak ill of no one, and flee from those who do. Be very patient, for patience carries us to heaven. Mortification and sacrifices please our Lord a great deal. Confession is a sacrament of mercy. For this reason it is necessary to approach the confessional with confidence and joy. Without confession, there is no salvation. The Mother of God wants more virgin souls, which bind themselves to her by the vow of chastity. I should like to go into the convent, but I should like much more to go to heaven. To be a religious, it is necessary to be very pure in soul and body. Here Mother Godina asked, "And do you know what it means to be pure?" I do. To be pure in body is to keep chastity. To be pure in soul is not to commit sins, not to look at what one should not see, not to steal, never to lie, always to tell the truth, whatever it costs us. Those who do not keep the promises they make to Our Lady will never be happy in their affairs. Doctors don't have light to cure the sick because they don't have love of God. Who taught you all these things? Asked Mother Godino. It was Our Lady, but some I think of myself. I like very much to think. Jacinta's mother visited her more than once at the asilo before returning to Aljustrel. Mother Godino made her feel at home, and drew her out with a woman's curiosity about each member of her family. She was particularly interested in Teresa, who was then 15, and in Florinda, who was 16. "Wouldn't you be pleased if they had religious vocations?" she asked. "God deliver me!" exclaimed Olympia. Jacinta did not hear this conversation, but afterward she said to Mother Godino, "Our Lady wants my sisters to be nuns. My mother doesn't want them to be, but for this Our Lady will take them to heaven before long." It was on Mother Godino's feast day, February 2nd, 1920, the feast of the Purification of Our Lady, that she took Jacinta to the hospital of Dona Stefania. It was a rather dark and depressing place, and one of the child's first disappointments after she had been placed in bed 38 of the children's ward on the ground floor. There was no chapel, no home for the hidden Jesus. Then there was a long and careful examination by Dr. Castro Freire, the chief surgeon, a noted pediatrician. And his conclusion, after confirming the diagnosis of pleurisy, was that an operation must be performed as soon as she got a little stronger. "It won't do any good," said Jacinta. "Our Lady came to tell me that I'm going to die soon." One day she looked up and saw her father standing in the doorway. He had come all the way from Aljustrel to see her, but he had to hurry back in a few hours because some of his other children were sick, and Olympia needed his help. Perhaps it was by him that Jacinta sent word to Lucia that Our Lady had visited her again and had told her the day and hour of her death. Mother Godino came to the hospital every day, and she had many conversations with her. Once the madrina mentioned a certain priest who had delivered a wonderful sermon and was much praised by fashionable ladies for his theatrical voice and manner. "When you least expect it," said Jacinta, "you will see that that padre is wicked." Within a few months the great preacher left the priesthood under scandalous circumstances. This was only one of Jacinto's prophecies that came true. A doctor who asked her to pray for him when she went to heaven was surprised to hear her say that he and his daughter were going to die shortly after she did. And they did. To Mother Godino, who wanted to visit Cova da Iria, she said, "You will go, but after my death, and so will I." When Jacinta was taken to the operating room on February 10th, she was so weak that local anesthesia had to be given instead of chloroform or ether. She wept when she saw her body unclothed and in the hands of men. Dr. Castro Freire then proceeded to remove 2 of her ribs on the left side, leaving an opening large enough to contain his fist. The pain was terrible. "Ay, Nossa Senhora!" moaned the child. Ay, Nossa Senhora. Then she would murmur, Patience. We ought to suffer everything to go to heaven. It is for your love, my Jesus. Now you can convert many sinners, for I suffer much. At last it was over, and they took her back to the ward, this time to bed 60. Dr. Freire and his assistant felt that the operation had been successful. But Jacinta knew better. For 6 days she continued to have excruciating pains. Then on the night of February 16th, she told Mother Godino that she had seen Our Lady. She told me she was coming for me very soon and would take away my pains. From then on she had no more pain, but she felt certain that the hour of her going was almost at hand. She sent urgently for Dr. Lisboa to tell him some secret, probably about himself. He was busy and supposed there would be time to see her later. But at 6 o'clock on the evening of Friday, February 20th, she called her nurse, Aurora Gomes, my little Aurora, and told her she was about to die and wanted the last sacraments. 2 hours later she made her confession to Father Pereira dos Reis of the Church of the Holy Angels, who promised to bring her communion next morning. Jacinta was not there the next morning. At 10:30 that evening the nurse left her for a few moments and returned just in time to see her breathe her last sigh, a rosy flush on her cheeks, a half-smile on her lips. Perhaps the nurse's name was symbolic. It was night in the dingy hospital, but it was forever dawn in the soul of Jacinta, as the Mother of God bent over bed 60 and gathered her into the arms that had enfolded the Christ in infancy and in death. The news quickly got about, and some Catholics who believed in the Fatima apparitions raised money to pay the funeral expenses, the burial to be on Sunday, February 22nd, in one of the cemeteries of Lisboa. The Marquesa of Rio Maior had the body arrayed in a white communion dress, while the Marquesa of Lavradio added a blue cape, and thus, wearing the colors of Our Lady, it was laid in a white coffin and taken to the Church of the Holy Angels, where it was placed across 2 small benches in the sacristy. In giving permission for this, Father Pereira dos Reis, the pastor of the church, had had no idea how many people in Lisboa had heard of Jacinta and believed in the Fatima revelations. Nevertheless, he received the first visitors with patience and kindness. It was only when more and more kept coming that he became uneasy. He asked them not to touch rosaries, crucifixes, or images near to the body. When some of them refused to obey, he drove them out of the sacristy. They had not expected this, for he had the reputation of being a charitable and courteous priest, and there was a great deal of talk and resentment. Yet the Fatima devotion had not been approved or authorized, and the Church does not permit public honors to the dead until their sanctity has been recognized in some official way after careful investigation. Naturally, too, the Parroco did not wish to offend the Cardinal Patriarch, and the sanitation authorities might perhaps raise some objection, as in fact they did. To free himself from further responsibility, Father Pereira had the body removed to the Casa do Despacho of the Brotherhood of the Most Blessed Sacrament outside the sacristy, locked the door, and turned the key over to Senor Antonio Rebelo de Almeida, an undertaker of the Rua da Escola Politecnica, in one of the old and tawdry quarters of the city. Meanwhile, plans for the burial in Lisboa had been given up, when word came from the Baron de Albaizere, offering a grave in his plot in the cemetery of Urim. On February 23rd, the undertaker allowed a few persons to see the remains before he enclosed them in a lead casket. All remarked an agreeable odor like that of flowers, and some insisted that the cheeks still had a faint roseate flush, giving an impression of life and health. Next morning the casket was sealed, taken to the train station, and placed on a train for Chao de Machas, hence to be driven to Urim. On that day there was a large annual assembly of the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Lisboa. On that day there was a large annual assembly of the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Lisboa. Many charitable rich men attended, for one must do something for the poor, and the Cardinal Patriarch, Dom Antonio Mendes Bello, a man with a strong, purposeful face that bore a striking resemblance to that of the actor George Arliss, though perhaps there was a little more rigor in it, presided. The chairman read a message from Dr. Lisboa, regretting his inability to be present, for he was busy with another work of charity concerning one of the children of the Fatima apparitions. The whole assembly, including His Eminence, burst into a loud and raucous laugh. This quickly got about the city, and gave no slight offense to devotees of Our Lady of Fatima. Meanwhile, in anti-clerical circles, it was whispered that both the Marto children had been murdered by Catholics to avoid unpleasant contradictions in their stories, and to leave only the affirmations of Lucia as the official version. Jacinta was far beyond the reach of cold hearts and lying tongues in the cemetery at Orem. A few persons went from Aljustrel to attend the simple funeral. Marto was one of them, saying over and over, "And you died there alone. You died there sola." Chapter 17. Wherever Lucia walked, a dark silhouette between the moors and the sky, something reminded her of Jacinta or of Francisco. Every sheep, every star that twinkled into the night, every sunset and sunrise told her again that they would never return. The wind in Cabezo brought a dear imaginary voice, saying, "I will never see you again, Lucia. I'm going to heaven, but you stay here alone." The scent of rosemary or of wild mint had power to conjure up an invisible little girl who bent over her, saying, "I do as the angels do. I give you flowers." On top of every wall there was a pensive boy playing softly on the pífaro, as he watched the red glare of the dying day on the water of the lagoa. Her mother and sisters tried in many ways to make amends for their former lack of understanding and sympathy. Maria Rosa would always be counted upon to do her duty when she saw it. Her eldest daughter, Maria de los Angeles, had a warm and affectionate nature. Her fine, spiritual, and motherly face is evidence that she could never have done willful injury to anyone. Yet the very fact that the apparitions and miracles had now been verified was a new barrier between Lucia and the other members of her family. If a prophet is without honor in his own country, neither is a mystic ever completely at home in his own household. There was bound to be an unbridgeable gulf between a girl who had spoken with a mother of God and had been charged by her with a mission on which the future of mankind depended, and the older sisters, however lovable and admirable, who were devoted to dancing, gaiety, husbands, and children. A girl with Lucia's past was doomed to loneliness, in a human sense, no matter where she might wander in a world whose criteria were no longer hers. Thus, even on that memorable day, when her aunt Olympia took her to Orem to visit the grave of Jacinta, her grief was her own and incommunicable, having overtones of hope and joy which the older women could never have understood. Older, there is something eternally childlike in Olympia, even in her 70s. Her privileged niece, at 13, had the grave patience of one who knows what lies behind earthly appearances. It made her lot no easier to realize that she was now the center of all the interest, favorable or unfavorable, that the extraordinary events at Fatima had evoked. She alone could answer the continual bombardment of questions and objections, and the only persons in whom she could fully confide was beyond her reach. Hers was no small responsibility before God and men. She had been given a part in something more than an ephemeral rustic drama. This was obvious from the revelations themselves. Little Jacinta had seen it. Francisco had known it. It was implicit in some of the scenes that took place on the Serra. Men like her brother Antonio and Timarto needed no college degrees, to be able to predict that if the tension between the pilgrims and the skeptical continued, a civil war might well be the outcome. The more the government at Lisboa tried to suppress the devotion, the more fervently the followers of Our Lady of Fatima resolved to vindicate her honor. There was a remarkable demonstration on the May 13th following the death of Jacinta. That was the day when the famous statue was set up in the shrine. A certain man had gone to Cova da Iria a year or two before with scorn instead of love in his heart. One story has it that he had a bomb in his pocket, which he intended to use to destroy the chapel in the presence of all the crowd, but on putting his hand in the pocket, he found a rosary instead. A more probable version of the story is that his sister had left the rosary there for his unbelieving hand to encounter at the right moment. At all events, he was touched by grace and returned to the practice of his faith, and out of gratitude, he promised to have a statue made for the chapel. He went to great pains to ascertain from Lucia just how Our Lady had looked, and spared no expense to make the work accurate and beautiful. Whatever might be said of his art, it had the power, especially in profile, to suggest something infinitely pure, simple, and spiritual. It could awaken an almost fanatical devotion in the breasts of many who knelt before it or followed it in procession. And there were scenes of delirious joy when it was first set in its place of honor on May 13, 1920. That was precisely the day when the government, resolving to temporize no longer with an invasion of mysticism, had sent a couple of regiments of the regular army to Cova da Iria. When the pilgrims began to arrive, they found rifles and bayonets hedging the scene of the apparitions. Undaunted by this, they formed a still larger cordon of the barefoot and humble all about the men in uniform, and proceeded to recite the rosary and sing Our Lady's songs, with such passion that before long the guards themselves began to take part, as Roman legionaries used to join the unarmed Christians in the arenas. Soon their ranks were broken, and they were on their knees with the others about the Azeneda and the chapel, when the new statue was borne tenderly and triumphantly to the place prepared for it, the place where it has been honored with some interruptions to this day. At one point of the persecution, Maria Carrera used to keep it in her house, for fear of desecration, except on the days of pilgrimage. Once it was taken to Lisboa, where it was welcomed by the people, with an enthusiasm to which some attribute the escape of the city thus far from the doom that Jacinta had foreseen. Certainly, all Portugal was in a sad plight morally, politically, and economically in 1920. In the 16 years following the Revolution of 1910, there were 16 bloody revolutions and 43 changes of ministry at Lisboa. The men who fomented and perpetrated the chaos were part of a revolt against Christianity, which modern popes have traced to the upheaval of the 16th century and even further back, and which continues every year to pursue its goal of world domination. Pope Benedict XV saw plainly from the watchtower of St. Peter by the Tiber a great deal of what has since occurred. Morals are much more depraved and corrupt than formerly, he lamented in 1920. The fond hope and wish of every renegade is the speedy rise of some universal state based on the complete equality of men and women in common ownership of property as a fundamental principle, in which neither any distinctions of nationality, nor authority of parents over children, nor of public authority over citizens, nor of God over man living in society is acknowledged. If these principles are put into practice, dreadful horrors must necessarily follow. These are the words taken from the Pope's motu proprio, Bonum Sane, July 25, 1920. A few days later, appealing for help for the new Polish state against the mysterious Soviet power that had seized control of Russia only a few weeks after the apparition at Cova da Iria, the Pope made another prophetic observation. Quote, "Not only is the national existence of Poland in danger, but all Europe is threatened by the horrors of fresh wars." This, stated in a letter, Con vivo compiacimento, August 5, 1920. Revolutions are noisy, but God works quietly and patiently. On August 5, 1920, the very day when Benedict spoke those words, something occurred which was to have profound effects upon Portugal, the Fatima devotion, and especially the life of Lucia Abobada. A bishop was consecrated as head of a new diocese of Leiria, including Cova da Iria, Aljustrel, and all the rest of the Serra, which the Holy Father had made independent of Lisboa. Don José Alves Correia da Silva was a professor at the seminary of Porto when Pope Benedict selected him for this most important post. Born near Braga in 1877, he was of medium height, dark, and rather corpulent. His face, like so many in northern Portugal, was more Celtic than Latin, and concealed under a habitual expression of benignity certain traces of suffering that were evident only to those who knew his history. Dom José had endured more than ordinary persecution under the Republic of 1910. Dragged from his rectory and thrown into prison, he had been tortured by being made to stand in icy water day and night, with the result that he became permanently lame and walks with great difficulty. This cross he cheerfully accepted. He had an especial devotion to the Mother of Sorrows and had made 6 pilgrimages to her shrine at Lourdes, where after his release he had begged her, with other Portuguese refugees, to have mercy on his country. Later he had returned to give lectures at Porto, where his intelligence, his gracious and charming manners, and his gift for friendship endeared him to students and fellow teachers, while his sound and scholarly articles in the Catholic press made him favorably known as far away as Rome. One of the first acts of the new bishop when he arrived in the ancient city of Saint Isabel was the formal consecration of his diocese on the Feast of the Assumption, 1920, to the Mother of God. And if ever there was a man who needed her help, it was he. 10 years of persecution following other years of complacency and indifference had left the church in a bad way, especially in the cities. Many clergy were still dispossessed, scattered, exiled, without income. The new diocese had no funds for building and other expenses. Through ignorance and neglect, large numbers of people had given up Mass and the sacraments. Even the old episcopal residence next to the Cathedral of Leiria was being used for barracks and government offices, and the new bishop had to find quarters in a house at an inconvenient distance. As if there were not enough problems already, there was the vexing affair of Fatima. Not long after his consecration, Dom José was presented with the 357,000 reis collected by Maria Carrera, with the request that he dispose of it as he might see fit. About the same time there came a delegate from the archdiocese at Lisboa, who delivered to him the whole dossier of the case. It was now his problem. The cardinal was no doubt very glad to be rid of it. Dom José saw that it was necessary to proceed cautiously. He had letters from enthusiasts demanding that he recognize the devotion at once and proceed to build a sumptuous shrine. Yet there were others from persons worthy of respect, including priests, denouncing the whole affair as a delusion or a deceit, and arguing that it gave the enemies of the Church one more weapon to use against her when she solely needed a period of quiet in which to repair the ravages of the persecution. It was not easy for a newcomer to decide. Whatever course he took, he was bound to give offense to somebody. It's likely, however, that such a man as Dom José would have acted promptly if he had been able to make up his own mind. But what was he to think? 2 of the chief witnesses were dead. Lucia always made a bad first impression on anyone who met her, nor did she ever try to be ingratiating. When all was said, the story was strange and appeared to be improbable. One thing seemed evident. Something had to be done about Lucia Abobada, the sole center of the controversy, and the sole witness since the death of Jacinta. There is no doubt that such a girl, almost untaught, did stand in danger from the possible violence of people who decried the apparitions and from the certain flattery of devotees inclined to canonize her. it seemed best to have her leave the Serra for a considerable period. If the affair of Fatima had been due to any delusion or deceit on her part, her absence ought gradually to put an end to it. If, on the other hand, the story was true, devotion would doubtless continue, and a just decision could be made. After further inquiries and much reflection, and more than one conversation with Lucia and other members of her family, the bishop asked Maria Rosa to visit him and to bring her daughter on the feast of St. Anthony, June 13th, 1921. They chatted for a while. Then Dom José asked the child how she would like to leave Ajustrel and attend a good school. Lucia looked pleased. To be rid of all the questions and controversies, to be able to forget her grief and loneliness in new surroundings, to learn to read and write. Well, to travel. Why not? Maria Rosa was even more favorably impressed. The continual strain of having such a daughter, even after the proof of the apparitions, had been almost more than she could bear. She was always wondering what was going to happen next. Her hearty acquiescence, so unflattering to her daughter, may have startled his lordship a little, but it also pleased him. He said that Lucia could enter a school of the Sisters of St. Dorothy near Porto, and that she had better leave in a few days. Yes, Senor Obispo. And you will tell no one where you're going, he added in his quiet voice. Yes, Senor Obispo. In the school where you're going, you will tell no one who you are. Yes, Senor Obispo. You will say nothing more to anyone about the apparition of Fatima. Yes, Senor Obispo. On the way back to Aljustrel, Lucia and her mother passed groups of people returning from the pilgrimage at Cova da Iria. Her few preparations were soon made, and she spent her last day, June 18th, in a series of farewell visits. She climbed the slope of Cabezo for a last look at the valley where she had first seen the angel. And going to the cave, she prostrated herself on the ground beside the rock where he had knelt, and said the prayers he had taught her. O my God, I believe, I adore, I hope, and I love you. Most Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, I adore you profoundly. Lucia climbed over the rocks and went down the other slope to Valinos. There, at the break of the wall under the olive trees, was what was left of the Azeneda where she had seen Our Lady on August 19th, 1917. Pious hands had raised a circle of field stones around it to the height of about 2 feet. Usually there are some daisies there left by children, sometimes a vinten or two. Lucia knelt and poured out her grief and her love. It was not easy to leave these places. It would not have been easy even if she had had no memories but those of her games and conversations with Francisco and Jacinta. Remember, you will have much to suffer, but the grace of God will be your comfort. Lucia went down the road between the high walls to the lagoa. Perhaps there were women washing there, men watering cattle on the other side, but Lucia saw Francisco and Jacinta bending over to drink the brackish water of the Barredo. How many times did they meet there on their way to the Serra? There was no one else at Cova da Iria, and she knelt alone at the plucked tree. Here 5 times she had seen the Mother of God. Here, too, she had seen Christ and Saint Joseph. Yet, except for the meager chapel, it was still almost a wilderness of undulating moors, too far and inaccessible ever to be of much interest to civilized communities. The heat was withering, the sky a vast glare of blue. How huge and uninhabited the world could be. The words came to mind. I am the Lady of the Rosary. Do you suffer a great deal? Don't be discouraged. I will never forsake you. On the way home, Lucia stopped at Fatima to say a last prayer at St. Anthony's Church, where she had been baptized, where she had received her first communion, where she had spent many hours alone with the hidden Christ. She said goodbye to San Quinteria, to St. Anthony. As she left, the bell in the tower was beginning to ring the Angelus. Behold the handmaid of the Lord, let it be done according to thy word." She crossed the road to the cemetery, and knelt by the mount that showed where Francisco lay. The sun was already low in the west, and the old wall cast a cool shadow on the grave and on the kneeling girl. "Goodbye, Francisco. Take care of me in heaven." On the way down the street of Aljustrel, she stopped to say goodbye to her uncle and aunt. It was a sad moment, for these had been 2 terrible years for T. Marto and T. Olimpia. Not only had Francisco and Jacinta left them, but Florinda had died in 1920 and Teresa in 1921. Yes, Jacinta had been right again. 4 children dead in something like 23 months. It was a high price that Olimpia paid to become a strong woman. After a brief prayer in the room where Francisco had died, Lucia went home, wiping the tears from her eyes, and found her mother preparing the supper. Maria Rosa said, "We're going to start before dawn for Ladia, where no one must know where we're going. Besides, it would be a long journey to Porto. Manuel Carrera was coming to drive them there with his team." Lucia slipped out to the well for a last look at the sky through the leaves of the fig trees. It was a serene and beautiful night, jeweled with stars. "The lamps of the angels," she could hear Jacinta saying. Maria Rosa was calling her to supper. Afterward she went to the corral, where 2 or 3 sheep remained after the flock had been sold. "Goodbye, my little friend," she said, patting their woolly heads, and went back to the house. She remembered the rope girdle that Jacinta had given her before going to the hospital and burned it. Now it was time for bed. Her mother called her at 2 in the morning. Ticarreda was already waiting outside with the cart. The moon had risen, paling the stars and making the serra wonderfully alive and mysterious. "The lamp of Our Lady," Jacinta had called it. "Goodbye, goodbye." They were soon on the road, leading westward. When they came to Cova da Iria, Lucia said, "Let us stop here and pray the rosary." The 3 got out of the cart, went down to the chapel. There was an oil lamp burning in it at the feet of the statue. There they knelt and said the 5 decades. The words came again in her mind. "Don't be discouraged. I will never forsake you." But Lucia wept again as she looked for the last time at the Azeneda, plainly gleaming in the eerie light of the moon. It was time to go, for they had a ride of 9 hours ahead. By dawn they were far beyond Batala, between the pines and the olive groves. At 11 o'clock they were at Ladia, where they were met by a lady sent by the bishop. 3 hours later Lucia boarded a train for Alfarelos, thence to Porto. Maria Rosa watched her depart, the tears coursing down her heavy cheeks. "Goodbye, goodbye." The train started noisily. Lucia Abobora had disappeared from Fatima and from all the world she had known. To all appearances, the Fatima episode was ended. Chapter 18. Mass was being said when Lucia and her guide arrived early next morning at the asilo of the Sisters of St. Dorothy at Vilar, a suburb of Porto, and she was taken at once to the chapel. She was glad to be able to receive Holy Communion, and to compose herself a little after a night of travel. The vaulted Gothic roof, with its ceiling of blue spangled with gold stars, somehow made her feel more at home. It was like the one over the altar at Fatima. The Mass over, she followed the portress to the sacristy, where she was presented to the Mother Superior and to the chaplain. Reverend Mother was not favorably impressed by the tired girl of 14 who stared at her rather sullenly from under dark brows, and who seemed to have a fixed pout on her heavy, half-parted lips. She had refused to take her at first, telling the bishop frankly that she wanted no simpletons in her house, because she did not want to make simpletons of the other pupils. "Yes, she is simple," Dom Jose had said, "but I don't think you'll find her a simpleton, and I wish you would take her for a while." As she looked at the girl herself, Reverend Mother began to wonder if she should not have been firmer with her old friend, the former professor at the seminary of Porto. but having given her word, she proceeded to carry out all his wishes. "When they ask you your name," she said, "you will reply, 'Call me Maria of the Sorrows.'" "Yes, Reverend Mother." "When they ask you where you're from, you will say, 'I am from near Lisboa.'" "Yes, Reverend Mother." "As for what happened at Fatima, never again mention it to anyone, either by question or by answer." "Yes, Reverend Mother." "Not to anyone. Do you understand?" "Yes, Reverend Mother." "You will not go to walk with the other girls, but you will not say why you do not go. Do you understand, my dear?" "Yes, Reverend Mother." "That is all." The new student was shown her room and given a uniform of black and white checked gingham such as the others wore. So she was to be called Mary of the Sorrows, Maria of the Sorrows. She would have preferred Maria of Jesus, since she had been christened Lucia of Jesus, but patience! Our Lady had told her, "You shall have much to suffer." This was only the beginning. For the next 4 years, Mary of the Sorrows led the quiet and ordered life of an average convent boarding school student. Each day after early Mass there would be a succession of classes, recreation, manual work, prayers, manners to learn, themes to write, head-splitting declinations and conjugations to memorize, little speeches to be made. As the months passed, she learned sewing, embroidering, typewriting, cooking, waiting on table, scrubbing floors, polishing brass and silver. Doubtless there were many blunders and heartaches at first before she was able to adapt herself to a routine so different from that of Aljustrel. But after a while, the sense of haste and strain left her, and she became a faithful and obedient, if not a brilliant, pupil. During the 4 years, she never revealed her identity. She never mentioned Fatima, not even to her mother, who visited her twice, once at Porto and once at the convent of the order in Braga. Not once in all that time did any of the nuns or students suspect who or what she was. The wise Mother Superior had taken good care to carry out the bishop's instructions. She understood perfectly why it had to be so. If the apparitions turned out to be illusory, or so she explained later, Lucia would gradually forget them, and it was better that way. If they were real, she would never forget, and no harm would be done, but she would escape the danger of learning false pride through flattery until she had attained a certain degree of maturity. The young girl herself came to understand the necessity of this. She began to think of herself naturally as Maria das Dores. At moments, it seemed as if Lucia Bobada had only been a girl she had dreamed about. If now and then some journalist, investigating the phenomena of Fatima, traced a clue to the convent door, the portress would answer calmly, "Nope, no one here called Lucia." The Abobora girl, for all practical purposes, was dead. Yet there were compensations in this lowly existence. To the casual eye, the Asilo de Pilar was a plain building on a hilly street in a rather dingy part of town, with a drab seminary on one side, a factory on the other, and a cemetery nearby. It was very different when one had passed through the quiet building and ascended the hill on the other side of the gardens that lay hidden, like all the secrets of the great king, from vulgar prying eyes. Surely St. Dorothy, patron of horticulture, must be well pleased with those 6 gardens, flamboyant and fragrant with rare and gorgeous flowers of every color and description. There was a wonderful view also from the upper windows of the house or from the nearby hill. One could see the river Douro coiling like a great flat silver snake as it finished its long course from the mountains of Spain to the harbor of Porto, where ships of all nations came and went. It was thrilling to glimpse the pine forest of Cavaco far away, and beyond the long yellow tongue of beach that defined the harbor, the sunlight on the vast blue Atlantic. The ocean always reminded her of the grandeur and the power of God. Convent routine, which seems so oppressive to some people of the world, becomes delightful and satisfying to those who accept it freely. Lucia learned to love the order and regularity of it, the freedom from the petty frictions and worries of family life, the sense of living only in the present. and leaving the past and the future in the hands of God. She came to love the good women who toiled so cheerfully and unselfishly so that she might have an education, far from the prying questions of pilgrims and the small daily vexations of Maria Rosa. Yet they had faults there too, but their effect was lessened by prayer and by the firm tact of a good superior. Here in these cloisters there was peace. Lucia began to be glad that the bishop had sent her there. The sisters on their part soon discovered what many others remarked, that first impressions of Lucia were deceptive, perhaps because her humility kept her from trying to make a favorable impression. As the bishop had said, her simplicity was by no means that of a simpleton. They came to respect and love her ready obedience, her unselfish willingness to sacrifice her own convenience for others at all times, her extraordinary devotion to God. More than most girls of her age, she seemed constantly aware of his presence no matter what she was doing, and when she had leisure moments she liked to spend them in the chapel rather than playing or talking. She read and reread the Portuguese translation of L'Histoire d'une âme, the autobiography of little Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, who was beatified in 1923. Lucia's own experiences helped her to understand the desire for suffering reflected in many passages such as this one. My heart thrills at the thought of the frightful tortures Christians are to suffer at the time of the Antichrist, and I long to undergo them all. Open, O Jesus, the book of life, in which are written the deeds of thy saints. All the deeds told in that book I long to have accomplished for thee. Yet Lucia, like the little flower, realized that her vocation was not martyrdom, but love. Her other favorite saint was the young Jesuit John Birchmans, who had given so perfect an example of the virtue of obedience, of small daily duties historically performed. I like these two saints, she said, because I can imitate them. After 4 years of this life of study, work, and prayer at Porto and other convent schools of the order, Lucia was a well-bred, self-contained young woman of 18. The time was coming when she must make up her mind what to do with the rest of her life. She had no desire to go back to the world. Perhaps it was her love for little Saint Therese that made her think of becoming a discalced Carmelite. But the Mother Superior discouraged this. She had had every opportunity to study Lucia during those 4 years. You are not strong enough for such austerities, child, she said. If you really have a vocation, it would be better to choose some other order with a simpler rule. Lucia accepted this with her usual humility as the decision of God, and after some further thought, asked to be admitted to the Institute of the Sisters of St. Dorothy. Why do you wish to be a sister of St. Dorothy? The Mother Provincial asked. So that I shall be more free to go to the chapel and pray. The Mother Provincial made her wait another year. At the end of that time, finding her of the same mind, she accepted her as a postulant. This was in 1925, at the convent in Tuy, just across the Spanish border. It was the year of the canonization of little Saint Therese of Lisieux. A year later, on November 2nd, 1926, Lucia became a novice. During the following year, 1927, she had 2 visions in which Christ himself appeared to her, confirming the requests of his mother concerning the devotion to her Immaculate Heart, and giving her permission to reveal certain things, but not, of course, the last secret of the July apparition. On November 3rd, 1928, she took her first vows as a lay sister. It was not until 6 years later, on October 3rd, 1934, that she made these vows perpetual. Lucia's mother, 2 of her sisters, some cousins, and a woman friend traveled all the way from Aljustrel to be present on that occasion. It was the first time she'd seen Maria Rosa in 13 years. 3 times the good woman had written to ask what she wanted as a present on her profession day. The 3rd time Lucia answered, "Some flowers and some bees." So Maria Rosa brought a large bunch of flowers, smelling of the serra, and a honeycomb full of bees, no doubt carefully enclosed. Was there some symbolism in this? Or was Sister Maria of the Sorrows human enough to tease her mother a little for those scoldings and spankings of other days? Perhaps she merely wanted to spare her an expense she knew she could not afford. Since 1934, Sister Doris, as she is commonly addressed in the cloister, has performed her humble duties in various convents of the order. She's often heard singing softly to herself as she scrubs floors, waits on table, or peels potatoes. But she is most happy in the hours she spends before the Blessed Sacrament. She does not need images to arouse her devotion. She usually kneels with her head bowed, her hands open and crossed upon her breast. Thus she remains sometimes for hours, sometimes all night, if permitted. One day she and another lay sister were walking from the convent at Tuy in Spain across the international bridge to do some shopping at Valencia, which is in Portugal. At the Portuguese end of the bridge, they met 3 ladies who stopped them and said, "Aren't you sisters of St. Dorothy? From the convent at Tuy? Oh, how nice! We're going there. We hear Lucia is there, the one who saw Our Lady of Fatima." The 2 Dorotheans looked at each other. "It's true that she's in Spain, isn't she?" "Oh, no, Senora, I don't think so," said Sister Maria. "In fact, I'm quite sure she's in Portugal now." Oh. When the ladies had gone on, Sister Maria das Dores chuckled very much, as the 3 children had when they had tumbled over a wall in 1917 to escape from questioners. Just when her silence about her past and Fatima was broken has not been revealed. It's certain that on the night of January 25, 1938, the feast of St. Paul's conversion on being blinded by light from heaven, the young lay sister looked out of the window of her cell and saw the sky aflame, the whole vault of heaven fearfully aglow with crimson fire, which continued balefully from 9 o'clock in the evening until 2 in the morning. Next day the newspapers all over Europe recorded it. People had seen it from the North Sea to the Adriatic. In South Germany especially, it struck fear to many Catholic hearts. In Freiburg, Switzerland, the sky was said to be like a furnace. The same sinister glare was seen on the Belgian coast, in Spain, Hungary, Norway, Italy, Poland, and Greece. Sister Maria of the Sorrows was convinced at once that this was the strange light Our Lady had predicted at Cova da Iria on July 13, 1917. She remembers the lady said, "When you see a night illuminated by an unknown light, know that it is a great sign that God gives you that He is going to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, hunger, and persecution of the Church and of the Holy Father. To prevent this, I come to ask the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and to the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays." So it had come at last. It was nigh even at the gates. Sister Maria was undoubtedly allowed to communicate her fears to the Bishop of Leydia at once. That she did so in good time is plain from what she wrote him at Tuy on August 8, 1941. Quote, "Your Excellency is not unaware that some years ago God manifested that sign which the astronomers chose to designate by the name Aurora Borealis. If they look well into it, they will see that it was not and could not be in the form of which it appeared, such as an aurora. But be that as it may, God was pleased in this way to make me understand that His justice was ready to let fall the blow on the guilty nations, and in this way to begin to ask with insistence for the reparatory communion on first Saturdays and the consecration of Russia. His end was not only to obtain mercy and pardon for all the world, but especially for Europe. God in His infinite mercy made me feel that this terrible moment was approaching. And Your Excellency is not unaware how on opportune occasions I used to point it out. And I still say that the prayer and penance that are done in Portugal have not yet placated the divine justice, for they have not been accompanied by contrition or amendment. I hope Jacinta is interceding for us in heaven." End quote. Pope Pius XI was undoubtedly informed about this. Sister Maria Lucia was allowed to write him a letter, which has not been made public, but a person worthy of all credit assures me he saw a copy of it at the beginning of 1939. Whether the Holy Father believed or doubted the Fatima story, or whether his last illness and many anxieties made him postpone consideration of it during these months of his great strain, I do not know. As everyone does know, he died early in 1939, and the impact of World War II fell upon Poland in September of that year. Stalin, having instigated the Spanish War as a prologue, had now given Hitler the green light for the destruction of a pivotal Catholic country in the East, Poland. And here we recall the words of Our Lady of Fatima. I come to ask the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If they listen to my requests, Russia will be converted, and there will be peace. If not, she will scatter her errors through the world, provoking wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyrized. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. Chapter 19. Sister Maria das Dores was not frightened by the strange illumination. She could see beyond the hellish thing that was descending upon Europe, and she knew that the Lady, who had promised never to forsake her, would conquer in the end. While statesmen toiled and lied, while the flower of youth was blasted, while old cities perished in flame and agony, the lay sister of St. Dorothy went about her humble tasks and prayers as usual. Sometimes sorrow visited her, as when she learned that her mother had died on the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel in 1942. And the rule of all strict orders, prohibiting members from leaving to attend the funerals of relatives, must have augmented the grief of a poor daughter who had long since forgiven the severities of poor Maria Rosa. Yet there are many joys also in convent life. Not the least was the good news that came from time to time from Covadonga. The cult of Our Lady of Fatima had grown astonishingly since her departure in 1921. The bishop's attitude had been one of encouragement from the beginning. Some say he received a secret message from Our Lady through Lucia. Others insist that he was won over by a miraculous rain of flowers that he saw at Covadonga. His unwillingness to publicize himself or to exploit Sister Maria das Dores during her lifetime makes it difficult to get at the exact truth at this time, even today. Certain it is, however, that only 4 months after her leave-taking, he permitted the first low mass in the chapel of the apparitions, and purchased the surrounding land from the Aboboras and others. In November of the same year, 1921, he set some men to work making a cistern near the shrine to collect rain for pilgrims, and was deeply impressed when a spring of pure, clear water bubbled up from the dry, rocky soil, increasing in volume until it filled 36 taps and became the main supply of water for the peasants round about, and a source of health to many sick persons who drank it. Opening the formal canonical investigation the following year, the bishop wrote, "Of the 3 children who said they were favored by the apparition, 2 were dead before our arrival in this diocese. We have questioned the only survivor several times. Her account and her responses are simple and sincere, and we have discovered in them nothing against faith or morals." Expressing doubt that any qualities or powers of an almost untaught girl of 14 could have drawn such crowds to the scene, especially after her departure, or that any natural charms of that remote and barren place could have attracted them, he appointed a committee of investigation, and called upon his people to furnish any information they might have, whether favorable or unfavorable. The number of pilgrims steadily increased. Cardinal Mendes Bello, who had laughed at the affair in 1918, changed his opinion before his death in 1922, and regretted that he could not go to Fatima. The unrelenting opposition of the government and of the liberals of Santarém and Urim served only to whip the fervor of the devout to a steadier flame. On March 6, 1922, for example, the little chapel was destroyed by 4 bombs, though the altar and shrine were saved when a 5th bomb failed to explode. But on the following May 13th, some 60,000 believers assembled, despite the mobilization of the Republican Guard by the governor of Santarém, and made humble reparation to Our Lady for the outrage. In 1927, the bishop presided over a pilgrimage for the first time. The following year, he welcomed 300,000 persons in one day. In 1930, he officially recognized and accepted the devotion, declaring the visions of the three children worthy of faith, and asking the people to show their gratitude to the Mother of God by the purity and sincerity of their lives. In 1931, he was joined by all the other Portuguese bishops, including the new patriarch, Dom Manuel Gonçalves Cardinal Cerejeda. Several hundreds of miraculous cures, meanwhile, had been registered. Cures of tuberculosis, Pott's disease, blindness, deafness, spinal meningitis, cancer, paralysis, and many other afflictions, of which Father Fonseca, for example, gives ample accounts with names, dates, and details in his well-documented book. In June 1946, there was a great sensation over the instant healing of tuberculosis of Miss Maria José da Silva of Tomar. The following September 13th, when a lame youth threw away his crutches during a procession and walked upright for the first time in many years, he was congratulated by a great throng of men and women, many of whom were weeping with joy. Among them, the ex-queen of Italy and her daughter. Of the moral cures, there have been thousands. The conversions, the broken homes restored, the return of hardened sinners to the practice of the faith. To Our Lady of Fatima, the Portuguese attribute many of the blessings, both spiritual and material, that have come to their country in recent years. The republic which so long persecuted the Church and the Fatima pilgrims vanished in the anarchy of 1926. Three generals, amid popular acclaim, took over the government, and by various steps set up the dictatorship of Salazar, which has since ruled the nation. It is not within the scope of this work to appraise any existing political regime. Whatever else may be said for or against the present government at Lisboa, it has at least maintained peace and order. Hence the Church, purified by persecution already, has found time for recuperation and restoration, for training new priests, building seminaries, bringing lapsed Catholics back to the fold. Tremendous progress has been made in many ways under a new and vigorous hierarchy. Yet there is also much evidence to support the fears of Sister Maria das Dores that her people have not done nearly enough by way of reparation for the blasphemies and indifference of former times. After all the marvels of Fatima, only 4 million out of almost 8 million Portuguese pretend to be Catholics in any sense of the word. There are hardly more than 3,000 priests, about one for each 1,300 professing Christians. The Párroco of Vimieiro, birthplace of Mr. Salazar, the president during the time this book was written, told me that he usually had about 150 out of a population of 1,200 at his Sunday Mass. In the large cities there's bitter anti-clericalism and much communistic activity. Churches are still closed at sundown for fear of desecration. Nuns do not dare appear on the streets in their habits. And the Salazar government still retains some of the church property confiscated by the Republic. President Salazar limits his practice of the Catholic faith to a barely discernible minimum, and as one of his officials said to me, "It is a mistake to call our regime Catholic. So far as the Church is concerned, we're neutral." This neutrality has helped in one way. However, when the clergy tried to extend Catholic action to aid the underpaid and underfed workers, they were told in no uncertain terms to confine their labors to spiritual affairs. They are not allowed to apply the social principles of the great encyclicals of Popes Leo XIII and Pius XI. They're not permitted to make any effective appeal to the anti-clerical masses in the cities. The Voz das Fatima stands almost alone against a financial regime ruled from London when it warns the rich that in paying starvation wages, they court the very red ruin they fear. Nevertheless, the priests and people are grateful for such freedom as they have received, and hope that the rest will follow in time. They are especially thankful that their country escaped the harrowing experiences of Spain in 1936. Anticipating the reign of terror that began there in July 1936, and fearing its spread throughout the peninsula, all the Portuguese bishops made a solemn vow at Cova da Iria as early as May of that year that if Our Lady protected their land from war and Red Revolution, they would return to make a public thanksgiving. This promise they kept at the great national pilgrimage of May 13, 1938, amid scenes of incredible rejoicing. There were similar manifestations in the subsequent years, when many had become convinced that Our Lady of Fatima had saved Portugal from World War II, as she had told the children she would. When the 25th anniversary of the apparitions was celebrated on May 13, 1942, a telegram came from Pope Pius XII, with his blessing to all the pilgrims, and to Portugal. Before the end of that year, the Pope consecrated the entire world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in the presence of 40,000 persons at St. Peter's in Rome. Thus, the Fatima devotion overflowed the boundaries of the Terra da Santa Maria and became worldwide. To Sister Doris, it seemed the fulfillment of the prophecy of Jacinta a quarter of a century before. The Holy Father, in a church, before the Immaculate Heart of Mary, praying, and so many people praying with him. It was a step also toward the final accomplishment of the wishes of Our Lady, even if the Holy Father did not mention Russia specifically. In his prayer, he did refer to the people separated from us by error and by schism, especially the one which professes a singular devotion to you, the one in which there is not a single house which did not display your venerated icon, today perhaps hidden and put away for better days. The public consecration of Russia has yet to be made. Sister Doris, meanwhile, remains not only the sole surviving witness of the apparitions, but the only person in the world who knows the last secret, of which nothing has been divulged, except that it means woe to some and joy to others. I heard in Portugal from a man of the highest credibility that when she was ill and in danger of death in 1939, she obtained permission from Our Lady, at the bishop's instance, to write it out and seal it up in an envelope marked not to be opened until 1960. If this cannot be verified at present, there is no such mystery about the 4 memoirs she composed at the command of Dom José, to make sure that her version of the events of 1917 would not be lost. These accounts, which I have read, written on ordinary lined notebook paper in a precise, clear, regular, rather commonplace handwriting, suggest a sane and well-balanced personality. It's interesting to compare them with the manuscripts of St. Teresa of Jesus in the Escorial. Both were written rapidly, with the intention of imparting truth rather than achieving literary effect. Neither has the smudges and other irregularities that betray neurotic or psychotic tendencies. And if Sister Doris lacks the individuality, the grand manner, the veritable genius of the Spanish mystic, at least she's not so disdainful of grammar and punctuation. The first account, written in 1936, contains many of the incidents I have related, besides a touching little poem in memory of dear Jacinta, somewhat after the pattern of St. Teresa's lyrics.
Ó tu que a terra passaste voando, Jacinta querida, numa dor intensa, Jesus amando, não esqueças a prece que eu te pedia, ser minha amiga, junto do trono da Virgem Maria. Lírio de candura, pérola brilhante, ó, lá no céu, onde vives triunfante, serafim de amor, com teu irmãozinho, roga por mim, aos pés do Senhor.
This memoir concludes with a request that if the bishop publishes what she has written, he will say nothing of her poor, miserable self, and assures him that if he burns it without reading it, she will be happy, having composed it only out of obedience. And now let's bring up the topic of the Angel of Peace. It was in the second memoir of 1937 that Sister Dorish first let fall a casual reference to the Angel of Peace. This was something like a bombshell, after 21 years of silence, and in some quarters it provoked consternation and even indignation. How could this be explained? What would people think? One visitor went so far as to say regarding this, "You will have to do many turns in purgatory, sister, for concealing such a thing all this time. I haven't the least fear of purgatory on that account. I have always acted under obedience, and there's no penalty or punishment for obedience." As a matter of fact, the angel story, confusing as it has been to some persons, supports her credibility. A pseudo-mystic or impostor clever enough to invent so remarkable a tale would never have drawn suspicion upon herself by a startling and uncalled-for addition many years later. And in all that time, a psychopath suffering from delusions would have had other hallucinations, surely. Yet her superiors and associates agree that she is a perfectly normal religious, who has never shown any inclination to parade her spiritual experiences. The third memoir, written August 8, 1941, contains further details about Jacinta, and an account of the weird light of January 25, 1938. When the bishop demanded a fourth and definitive account, Sister Dorish retired to the garret of the convent at Tuy on the morning of December 8, 1941, and, after praying a long while for the grace to set everything down correctly and in order, sat on a trunk near a small window and, holding a pad of notepaper on her lap, began her fourth and longest manuscript, in which she recorded for posterity the exact words of the angel and of the Lady of the Rosary, with all the circumstances she could remember of each apparition in succession. The beginning, in which she tells of opening the New Testament more than once in search of light, is somewhat long and self-conscious. Here perhaps she dramatizes herself a little. Once underway, though, the narrative proceeds swiftly and objectively. At the end, she makes some trenchant criticisms of errors she has found in the best-known books about the Fatima apparitions. After a quarter of a century, she was permitted to return to the scene she had described in the historic document. Perhaps it was fitting that her triumph and vindication should be reserved for the memorable pilgrimage of May 13, 1946. The Second World War was over, and the Portuguese well understood from what futile horrors they had been saved. Although rain fell all night and in the morning, a crowd of more than 700,000 pilgrims gathered at the Cova da Iria to give thanks to Our Lady of Fatima. Almost a tenth of the population of the country was there. A second-hand but unforgettable impression of that demonstration came to me in some motion pictures I saw 2 months later at the bishop's house in Leydia. The expanse of black bobbing umbrellas, the Portuguese prelates, and the papal nuncio humbly standing in the rain, the thousands upon thousands of handkerchiefs that fluttered like the waves of a white sea, or the wings of innumerable angels beating the wind. There was something unheard of, almost apocalyptic in the magnitude, the fervor, and the patience of that prodigious host. For parallels, one must go back to the children of Israel singing with Moses in the wilderness, or the medieval crusaders shouting back at Pope Urban II, or a St. Louis, "It is the will of God." Of the crusading enthusiasm of that pilgrimage, too, I observed some qualitative idea, at least, from the one I attended the following July. For the pattern is much the same month after month. On the 12th, the roads are full of picturesque groups, men predominating, and most of them poor. By nightfall, they're scattered over the great bowl of the Cova da Iria, finding places to hitch their burros, or lay down their packs to eat, to rest. Loaves of tough brown bread and bottles of wine are drawn from wicker baskets. Earthen water bottles are passed around or replenished at the holy well. Blankets are spread on the dry ground under the olive or carrasqueria trees. Here an old woman slowly advances toward the chapel on bare and bleeding knees. There a stunted peasant is warming some soup for his wife and children over 4 candles, which he shields from the breeze with his body and his sombrero. All the crowd are well supplied with candles, each encircled with a paper guard. By 10 o'clock, thousands of these tiny orange-tinted lamps are burning as the procession begins to form. They look strangely dim and ethereal as the full moon mounts higher in the east, flooding the serra with an unearthly radiance and lending a peculiar steely blue cast to the infinite dome above. As the wind becomes stronger, coming from the far ocean and the western mountains, the torches flicker, yet few are extinguished. Now they have assumed the order and form of a long, straggling procession that slowly moves up the hill toward the main highway. The voice of a priest is heard on a loudspeaker, leading the rosary. Thousands of voices, high and deep, male and female, respond with a thunderous and passionate rhythm. The head of the procession has reached the top of the hill, has turned, and is coming down another road toward the basilica. The slow, majestic pace, the dancing of innumerable lights, the hoarse and throaty voices convey an overpowering impression of an army not of blood, but of prayer, a host of crusaders, bearing the light of truth through the darkness of a hostile world, fearless of time and death, certain of triumph. What can resist these voices and footsteps of yesterday and of tomorrow? Between the mysteries of the Rosary, the marchers fling the aves of their favorite hymn to the metallic sky. Individuals cry out between the music their own hopes and supplications, sometimes with heartbreaking sobs. Lord, we adore you. Lord, we love you. Jesus, have mercy on us. Lord, you can cure me if you will. Yes, these voices seem to long to lustier and heartier times than ours. They come from the plain of Esdraelon, from the walls of Jericho and Constantinople, and the fields of Tunis, like the pulses of faith and of human personality, breaking through the mediocrity and regimentation of a machine age. The column of lights finally dissolves at the basilica. The thousands slowly push their way inside to attend benediction, and then to form in long queues by the confessional boxes, patiently waiting to tell their sins, so that they can receive Holy Communion at dawn. The prayers, the songs, the exclamations continue through the night. But at 2 a.m, many thousands have already disposed themselves for sleep. Around every tree, around the well, around the concrete platform of the chapel of the apparitions, one sees them lying prone in circles, the heads toward the center. Here under one blanket lie a young peasant and his wife. Under 2 or 3 others are huddled a man and a woman and their 4 children. A baby is inert on the breast of her sleeping mother. All are strangely silent and motionless in the death-like slumber of those who labor in the fields and think nothing of walking 50 miles to honor the Mother of God. Now, it's morning of the 13th. After a humble breakfast of dry bread wherever they have slept, the people form another procession, which follows the same route to the highway, and hence back to the basilica. This time the white statue of Our Lady of Fatima has been taken reverently from the chapel and is carried at the head of the column on the shoulders of 6 sturdy men, while in front, leading the second crusading army in the full glare of the summer heat, walk the Archbishop of Évora and the Bishop of Leiria. Dom José goes slowly and painfully, with stiff and swollen knees, an ungainly but heroic figure, in crimson and gold. As he finally climbs the steps of the basilica, he's smiling graciously, and few can guess what it has cost a gallant gentleman to pay his devoir to his lady. Perhaps the most moving of all the scenes is the one just between the High Mass and the noonday benediction. In a special place roped off for them, the sick are waiting patiently for this moment. Some on stretchers, some in wheelchairs with nurses, some hobbling on crutches. Paralyzed children in the arms of mothers, the blind, the emaciated. A priest descends from the basilica carrying the sacred host and a monstrance. All who are able fall on their knees as he passes between the rows of the doentes and holds it up before the face of each. I will not attempt to describe those faces, those eyes. There are no words for such love, such hope, such desperation, such adoration. One can only think of the atmosphere of the Gospels, as Lucia has reminded us. And seeing the multitudes, he had compassion on them, because they were distressed, and like sheep that have no shepherd. There are no sensational episodes on this occasion. Later, however, we hear of a man from the north who has been cured of cancer. At last it is finished, and the statue is being borne back to its place in the small chapel. All the people wave their handkerchiefs up and down in farewell. The effect is tremendous. It is more eloquent than all the shouts and the final Aves. But when the statue figure of Our Lady has passed, the multitude quickly melts away. Only a few small groups are still gathered here and there. Still fewer have taken the trouble to follow the statue to its home. There they are, kneeling about the humble building, still muttering their love and their petitions. Most of them women, and very poor ones too, in dusty garb, with black handkerchiefs over their heads and bare feet. Among them, on July 13th, I saw Tia Olympia, the mother of Francisco and Jacinta, earnestly saying her rosary. Such, on a much grander scale, and despite the rain, must have been the atmosphere at the greatest of all the pilgrimages, the one on May 13th, 1946. On that day, too, as a climax, the 750,000 pilgrims heard the voice of the Vicar of Christ speaking from Rome, and the force of all his words tended to heighten the impression of a modern crusade. Here are a few words of what he said. Your great concourse, the fervor of your prayers, the thunder of your acclamations, all the holy enthusiasm which vibrates without cease in your hearts, and finally the sacred rite, which in this moment of incomparable triumph has just been performed. They all call to our mind another multitude, innumerably greater, other cries of worship far more ardent, other triumphs yet more divine, another hour solemnly eternal, the endless day of eternity when the glorious Virgin, triumphantly entering the heavenly homeland through the 9 blessed choirs of angels, was raised even to the throne of the most Holy Trinity, who placed upon her brow the triple diadem of glory, and presenting her to the celestial court seated at the right hand of the immortal King of ages, crowned her Queen of the universe. So the Church salutes Her Lady and Queen of the angels and saints, of patriarchs and prophets, of apostles and martyrs, of confessors and virgins. She acclaims her Queen of heaven and earth, most glorious, most worthy Queen of the universe, the light shining in the sky amid the tears of this exile. You, by crowning the image of Our Lady of Fatima, signed as it were a document of faith in her supremacy, a loyal submission to her authority, a filial and constant correspondence to her love. You did yet more. You enlisted as crusaders in the conquest and reconquest of her kingdom, which is the kingdom of God. That is to say, you bound yourselves before heaven and earth to love her, to venerate her, to serve her, to imitate her, so that with her blessing you may better serve the divine King. And at the same time, you bound yourselves to labor that she may be loved, venerated, and served all around you, in the family, in society, and in the world. Sister Dorish may have heard the Holy Father's words, but she did not see the demonstration. It was a week later, on May 20th, that she arrived with the Mother Provincial of her order at Covadairia. She had left as an untutored girl of 14. She returned a calm and poised woman of 39. Most of the countryside was unchanged, but her brown eyes opened wide with amazement when she looked down on what had been the wilderness of Covadairia. It was partly enclosed by a wall. From 2 majestic gates descended roads that joined at the miraculous fountain, and then ascended to the lofty white basilica on the northern hill. The chapel of the apparitions had been completely rebuilt. To the left was an imposing hospice containing 2 or 3 chapels, the bishop's quarters, and a seminary. On the opposite hill, workmen were laying the massive foundations of another such building. Ground was being broken for an Italian seminary to the northeast. On another hill stood the new convent of the Discalced Carmelite nuns from Belgium. Hardly anything was the same there, except the carrasqueria tree to which the children had fled from the first flash of light, May 13th, 1917. From one of its limbs hung an Angelus bell, which João, the lame son of Maria Carrera, would ring at suitable hours. He also sold rosaries and attended to the fountain. And hovering bird-like about the chapel of the apparitions at almost any hour, one could see his mother, Maria da Capellina. Maria da Capellina, they now call her, removing withered flowers from the place where the Azeneda had been, or going about on her hands and knees, dusting the concrete floor with a whisk broom. Timarto was very much in evidence these days, wearing a blue shirt, with a black tie on Sundays, and in the lapel of his well-brushed coat, the button of Catholic Action League of Farmers. "Yes, I believed in it from the first," he would say. "Once a Spaniard came here and told me he could look at the sun any time. I dared him to prove it. He got under a fig tree and looked up through the leaves. 'Oh ho,' I said, 'come out here and look at it.' Of course he wouldn't. Then there was a communist here who said that it was all nothing but one great big stupidity. I said to him, 'Let us see you go back to your own town and make a stupidity as big as this one.'" When I asked T. Marto if he still hoed his maize and dug his potatoes, he said apologetically, "No, I don't do much work now. I'm only 73, but my legs are no good anymore. They're almost as bad as Dom José's." Dom José, as the people affectionately call their bishop, gives the impression of never allowing his affliction to stand in the way of anything he resolves to do. And the morning after the arrival of Sister Doris, he came from Ladia to say Mass at the little chapel especially for her. Meanwhile, the news of her coming had created quite a sensation all over the Serra. Soon people were flocking from all sides to catch a glimpse of her, and a crowd followed wherever they went. Naturally, she visited Aljustrel to speak with her sister Maria, her aunt Olympia, and her old friends and neighbors. They went with Father Galamba, representing the bishop, to verify all the scenes of the events of 1917. She pointed out exactly where the angel had appeared at Cabejo and at the well. She watched the women washing their clothes at the Lagoa. A priest who saw her standing at Valinos, gazing at the pile of stones where Our Lady had appeared August 1917, told me he was much impressed by her detachment and lack of vanity. She seemed wholly unaware that anyone was looking at her. After a visit to the church of St. Anthony at Fatima, where she noted all the changes and improvements, she crossed the road and entered the creaking gate of the old cemetery. Where she had left the little cross on the grave of Francisco, she found an impressive monument inscribed, "Here lie the mortal remains of Jacinta and Francisco Marto, to whom Our Lady appeared." For Jacinta, too, had returned to Fatima, as she had promised, long after her death. It was in 1935 that her body was taken from the cemetery at Urum and laid in a common grave with her brothers. When both coffins were opened, nothing was found of Francisco but his bones. But Jacinta's face was intact and incorrupt. She seemed to be only asleep, waiting for the resurrection, and the good odor of paradise hung about her. Her mother was one of those who saw her. Di Marta told me he was there, but could not get a very good look. "Ay, Jesus, There was such a crowd, I couldn't get near enough. Sister Maria das Dores went back to her convent. A few days later, the bishop ordered evidence taken in the cause for the beatification of Jacinta and Francisco of Fatima. Epilogue. It was in the convent of the Dorothean Sisters at Vilar, near Porto, that I had the privilege of conversing with Sister Maria das Dores on the afternoon of Monday, July 15, 1946. She seemed uncomfortable at first, and probably was, for she dislikes such interviews intensely, and submits to them only when ordered to do so. She wrung her hands nervously. Her pale brown eyes looked rather guarded and unfriendly. There was not much conviction in the high and timorous voice. A few moments later I had almost forgotten this first impression. She had begun to feel more at ease. She laughed readily, and when she smiled a little dimple would appear on each cheek. The voice now sounded natural and sincere. There was intelligence in this face, and charm. It was impossible not to like her, and to trust her. First I presented a few questions from America, some perhaps a little obvious and unnecessary. One, from a sculptor, was whether the rosary in the hand of Our Lady had had 5 or 15 decades. I didn't count them, she said quickly, with a mischievous smile. When the angel of peace gave you Holy Communion at Cabezo, did it seem to you like a dream or a vision, or was it like the reality of receiving Holy Communion in a church? She hesitated for the right word. I cannot be absolutely sure of that, because I was not in any ordinary state of mind during such an experience, and there was something so intimate, so interior, so intense about the apparition of the angel and what he said and did. But I believe it was like the real experience of receiving in a church, for I felt the contact of the host. Did you see our Lord in the year 1927? Twice. The answer was prompt and matter-of-fact. I was not permitted to question her as to what he said, nor was I allowed to ask about the conversations she has had with Our Lady since 1917. It's well known that there have been several such apparitions. According to the Message of Fatima, published at the shrine, the Blessed Mother said to her in her cell on December 10, 1925, quote, "Look, my daughter, at my heart, surrounded with the thorns with which ungrateful men wound it by their blasphemies and iniquities. You, at least, try to console me, and announce that I promise to assist at the hour of death with the graces necessary for salvation all those who, on the first Saturdays of 5 consecutive months, confess, receive Holy Communion, recite part of my rosary, and keep me company for a quarter of an hour, meditating on its mysteries, with the intention of offering me reparation." Sister Doris made this known, and it has given great impetus to the Immaculate Heart devotion. When you reported the words of the angel and of Our Lady, did you give the exact words as they were spoken, or only in the general sense? The angel's words had an intense and overpowering quality, a supernatural reality that could not be forgotten. They seemed to engrave themselves exactly and indelibly upon the memory. It was different with the words of Our Lady. I could not be sure that every word was exact. It was rather the sense that came to me, and I put what I understood into words. It's not easy to explain this. Our Lady showed you many souls going to hell. Did you get the impression from her that more souls are damned than saved? This question amused her a little. I saw that those were going down. I didn't see those that were going up. Does the statue in the shrine of Covadairia look like the lady you saw there? No, not much. I was disappointed when I saw it. For one thing, it was too gay, too alegre. When I saw Our Lady, she was more triste, or rather more compassionate. But it would be impossible to describe Our Lady, and it would be impossible to make a statue as beautiful as she is. She left the room a moment, and returned with a small print of Our Lady on some sort of transparent plastic material, the most simple and unadorned I had seen, and she handed it to me. "This is the picture that comes nearest to what I saw," she said. Our Lady seemed to be made all of light, and her garments were also. There was no border of gold, no ornamentation. In many books about Fatima, the prayer Our Lady asked you to say after the decades of the Rosary is given in some such form as this: "O my Jesus, pardon our sins, save us from the fire of hell, have mercy on the souls of purgatory, especially the most abandoned." Is that correct? "No, it is not," she replied positively. The correct form is the one I have written in my account of the apparition on July 13th. "O my Jesus, pardon us, and save us from the fire of hell. Draw all souls to heaven, especially those in most need."
Ó meu Jesus, perdoai-nos e livrai-nos do fogo do inferno. Levai as alminhas todas para o céu, principalmente aquelas que mais precisarem.
Have you ever read the works of Saint Teresa of Avila? I was thinking especially of the descriptions of uncreated light in the Libro de su Vida. No, parts of them were read to us in the refectory. Have you had any revelation from Our Lady about the end of the world? I cannot answer that question. Some persons believe that Jacinta's vision of a persecuted pope referred to some particular pontiff. Some believe the present Holy Father was the one she saw. Jacinta said it was a pope. There was nothing to indicate any particular pope. Why did you say nothing about the angel of peace for so many years? Nobody told me to. I am under obedience. The priest to whom I mentioned it at the time told me not to speak of it again. I never did until the bishop told me to write everything down. She explained the different effects of the apparitions of the angel and of Our Lady in terms very similar to those she had used in her memoirs. She seemed very fond of such words as intimo and intenso. Her recollections were clear and precise. The angel left us feeling exhausted, helpless, overpowered, and we remained lost to everything for hours. Our Lady always made us feel light and joyous. Finally, we came to the important subject of the 2nd July secret, of which so many different and conflicting versions have been published. Lucia made it plain that Our Lady did not ask for the consecration of the world to her Immaculate Heart. What she demanded specifically was the consecration of Russia. She did not comment, of course, on the fact that Pope Pius XII had consecrated the world, not Russia, to the Immaculate Heart in 1942. But she said more than once, and with deliberate emphasis, what Our Lady wants is that the Pope and all the bishops in the world shall consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart on one special day. If this is done, she will convert Russia, and there will be peace. If it is not done, the errors of Russia will spread through every country in the world. Does this mean, in your opinion, that every country, without exception, will be overcome by communism? Yes. It was plain that she felt that Our Lady's wishes had not yet been carried out. People must say the Rosary, perform sacrifices, make the 5 First Saturday communions, pray for the Holy Father. Did Our Lady ever say anything to you about the United States of America? She gave me a rather startled glance. Then she smiled in faint amusement, as if to suggest that maybe the United States was not so important in the general scheme of things as I imagined. No, she said gently, she never did. But I wish you would have masses said for me in the United States. I promised, and she said she would pray for me. It was almost 8 o'clock, and we had been talking for about 3 hours. Mother Pignatelli, who had been present in the interview with Father Galamba, Father Rocha, Father Furtado, and Mr. Daniel Sullivan, gave us all some lemonade and cakes. She and Sister Maria das Dores followed us to the porch. A black cat was sleeping there on the last warmth of the departing sun. The fragrance of roses and gardenias came down from one of the 6 beautiful gardens of the convent. As we took our leave, Sister Maria das Dores, who had entered that house as Lucia Abobora, leaned over the railing and gave us a charming smile of farewell. After my return from Portugal, I wrote several questions which His Excellency the Bishop Ladia was good enough to send to Sister Dores. Her answers, written February 17, 1947, reached me just too late for the first edition of this book. I summarize or quote the most important. First, the most specific request of Our Lady that Russia be consecrated to her Immaculate Heart by the Pope and all the bishops of the world on one special day was made in 1927, 10 years after the original revelations. Question: is it your opinion that the Pope and the bishops will consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart only after the laity have done their duty in rosaries, sacrifices, and First Saturday communions? Answer: the Holy Father has already consecrated Russia, including it in the consecration of the world, but it has not been done in the form indicated by Our Lady. I do not know whether Our Lady accepts it, done in this way, as complying with her wishes. Prayer and sacrifice are always the means necessary to draw down the graces and blessings of God. Question: did you write the wishes of Our Lady to Pope Pius XI? Answer: in 1929, I wrote the desires and requests of our Lord and Our Lady, which were the same, and delivered the writing to my confessor. He was then the Reverend Father Bernardo Gonçalves, a Jesuit. His Reverence transmitted it to His Excellency the Most Reverend Senor Bishop of Leiria, and some time later it was transmitted to His Holiness Pius XI. I do not know the exact date when it was communicated to His Holiness, or the name of the person of whom my confessor availed himself. But I remember that my confessor told me that the Holy Father had heard the message graciously and had promised to consider it. Question: can you give me a brief account of any other revelations you have received from Our Lady since 1917? Answer: what has been published of the revelations later than 1917 appears to me to be sufficient to make possible the realization of the wishes of our Lord, and I do not think the moment opportune to state anything further.